Hi, I'm Dave Gebroe. I threw my career as a licensed hearing instrument specialist in the trash, sold my house, and moved to the East Coast with my wife and 4-year-old son in order to focus on making the ultimate podcast for music obsessives thrive. Now I need your help. Although Discograffiti is rated in the top 2% of all podcasts globally, the economics of this thing are tricky. Becoming a member of Discograffiti's Patreon gives you access to over 100 more exclusive episodes. And moving forward now every Sunday for only $5 a month as a private first class, you get our new weekly show by and for Discograffiti's Patreon family, the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast. As a lieutenant, you get an ad-free, substantially elongated director's cut of every episode. And you'll be getting the shows a few days earlier than the general populace, which is designed to make you feel even more special than you already are. So when you become a major, you'll be getting access to the ultimate director's cuts of all our sprawling, super deep dive episodes. As far as I'm concerned, these super cuts have absolutely everything that was meant to be heard. Plus, you get yours before the lieutenants get theirs. But that ain't it. You also get all our other series, like Discograffiti's Top 10, our Buried Treasure show, Rock Cousteau, our Slag Off show, Queasy Listening, and exclusive limited series like The Private Press with Paul Major. And if you've got no financial worries to speak of, keep in mind that some of the higher Patreon tiers allow you to actually advertise on the show, choose the bands we cover, or even some of the guests we get. For the price of a cup of coffee a week, you can ensure my family's fed, build a music library that'll be the envy of your block, and connect to a thriving community of music maniacs all at the same time. Don't risk feeling badly about yourself by not giving. Patreon.com/Discograffiti. Once again, that's Patreon.com/Discograffiti. Welcome to Discograffiti, the Music Obsessives podcast that gives freaks like you and me the chance to connect with a brotherhood obsessed with rating the entire discography of every single artist and band that ever mattered. I'm your host, Dave Gebroe, and in this episode, we'll be turning our spray cans on the biggest failure of my entire life. Psst. And this is going to be a little bit of an unusual episode. This one's called The Story of Jesus 2. This one's going to be a little unusual because there is no guest. This one's about me, and it's about a corner of my life that on the daily I wish I could sort of scrub away and or forget. But it actually has informed so much of who I am today that it's so inextricably intertwined with how I carry myself. It's almost kind of impossible to see myself without this as part of my life. As many of you are already aware, I always wanted to be a filmmaker. You know, from single-digit age, when I was asked what I wanted to do, it was make movies. Sometimes it was be a special effects guy. Sometimes it was write about films, you know, be a movie critic. But typically it was make films. When I was 15 years old, I started writing a book of film criticism with the precociously sexually innuendoed title, Pleasures of the Dark, 75 Movies Under a Critical Eye. This is before I'd even lost my virginity, but I finished that book when I was 16. It was a 256-page book. Let's just say that making films was always what I was going to do. So I applied early decision at Boston University. I got in, and in September of 1992, I started taking film classes at BU. I did a couple of shorts where it was basically me just getting to know the camera. The camera at that time was a 16 millimeter Bolex camera that had no sound. It was a non-sync camera. And then my third short, which was shot the same way, was called Jesus 2. And actually, I never posted this onto YouTube, but somebody else did. I'm not sure who. I have no idea how they got the footage. It's an incomplete version of my short, which actually included a small sample of the extended traffic jam sequence from Godard's Weekend. There were music samples from Polito, Dinosaur Jr.'s You're Living All Over Me. I was sampling Lou Barlow as early as 1992. Anyway, you can see a portion of that film online if you look for Jesus 2. The plot was basically Jesus coming to in a trash-strewn alley in a big city, which was Boston at the time. It was my friend who looked Jesus-like at the time. His name is Josh Curtis. He is walking around the city, kind of disillusioned by what he sees. And he walks up to this guy who is actually carrying a bag from Second Coming Records, which I believe is not there anymore in Harvard Square, one of the places we shot, and goes up to this guy because he's carrying that bag that says Second Coming and holds his hand on the guy's forehead to sanctify him or some such thing. And the guy gives him a quarter, thinking he's a homeless guy, and Jesus winds up getting in a scuffle with him, beats the shit out of him. You know, I was trying to push some easy buttons at the time, and the guy had a joint in his pocket, and Jesus takes the joint, walks into a karate theater, lights up, sits down, and watches a Bruce Lee film while stuffing his mouth with popcorn. You know, for just out of the gate, it's a not bad effort from a brand new filmmaker. I made a couple more shorts when I was at Boston University, and then I got in trouble with the faculty over a script I wrote for a short I wanted to do called White Picket Fences. And that was like the first sign of trouble at Boston University. But I wound up getting suspended from school in April of 1993 over a stupid fraternity prank from which I was arrested, and there had been noise complaints in the house I was living. So I was suspended for a semester, and I figured since I was already out of school and I already knew how to make a film, and I was reading the electric Kool-Aid acid test, which mainly takes place in San Francisco, that I would move out to San Francisco, drive across the country, have a Tom Wolfe, Ken Kesey type experience, and make a feature film out of Jesus 2. So that's what I did. 5 months later, in August of 93, I hit the road. And an interesting thing about change that I learned, I wanted to change something about myself before I moved out to San Francisco. And I figured the easiest thing that there possibly was for me to do is to make myself like tomatoes. I always hated tomatoes. I always liked ketchup, but I always hated tomatoes. So I force-fed myself tomatoes until I loved them. Then when I hit the road, first thing I did, I had been a vegetarian for 9 months. I immediately ate 2 Big Macs, and I remember taking a picture of my bowel movement with our AAA map with the path marked off, sitting on top of the septic tank. I had started writing the script by that point and wound up moving into an apartment, a very cheap apartment in the Lower Haight, 439 Haight Street. Myself and my 2 friends got there in September of 93. 2 friends, one of whom wound up becoming Harvey Weinstein's assistant a couple years down the line, but at that time was just a friend from BU. The person who was to become Harvey's assistant, she decided immediately upon getting to San Francisco that she wanted to turn around and come back and live in New York, which is, of course, where she got the job at Miramax. But myself and 3 other guys moved into a very affordable place on Haight Street at 439 Haight Street in October. So it was actually October 8th, 1993. I became very serious at that point about writing the script and started writing pretty quickly. My monthly living expenses just for myself was literally $150. This was, of course, in 93. San Francisco obviously changed a great deal over the course of the next few years, but at that point, it was still pretty affordable. I finished the first draft of the script in that apartment, and my experiment in living with my friends collapsed after a little over 2 months. It was a pretty crazy place. I mean, one of us would, climb up the fire escape and crawl through the window in the middle of the day with LSD that we had just procured. And we would just, on a dime, decide to trip on acid or, all kinds of crazy shit. And after a little over 2 months in mid-December 93, I went back home to New Jersey and then came back out to San Francisco in February of 1994 to make the film. This is like a 2-month turnaround. So by that point, when I got to San Francisco in 94, I lived with my friend Tom Shea. We got an apartment at 5636 California Street in the Richmond district. By that point, I had raised $60,000 in cash and applied for and received a stack of credit cards with a total limit of $40,000. So I was basically looking at $100,000. If you were alive at the time, you remember this was the time of Clerks. And I remember reading in the newspaper the exact budget of Clerks. It was $28,495 or something like that. You were reading about these stories all the time. Never mind the failures that were in all likelihood happening, failures like mine and I'm sure many others, but you would just be reading about the successes. Somebody would go out like Robert Rodriguez, with $7,000 and make a film, and it would be picked up by Miramax, and they'd have a career for the rest of their life. So for that reason, I didn't think twice about it. This was just what I was doing. There was no was I or wasn't I going to make the film. There was no if this should happen. It was going to happen. And in fact, I remember my publicity plan for the movie was to utilize a bus that I was buying for the film as a prop and to use that to drive through San Francisco, pick people up at bus stops to take them to their destinations and show them clips of the movie. I mean, I had some pretty outlandish schemes. And this was not something I was maybe going to do. This is what I was planning on doing. So what I did was all the people that I knew from the Boston University film department, and there were a whole bunch. There was 15 or 20 people that I was pretty close with. I told them when they graduated, because, they were all still at school in their senior year, while I was out getting this stuff set up in San Francisco, everybody that I asked to come out, and I told them I would provide only shelter and a filmmaking experience. I wasn't able to provide anything else. So they had to pay for their own transportation, and I would put them up and feed them. And that was it. That was pretty much all I'd be able to afford because we were shooting on 35 millimeter. It was not, a couple people in a room sort of a thing. It was a sprawling epic that I was doing on a minuscule budget. So all of my friends came out except for one, and I found the perfect house for us, what seemed like it at the time, after weeks and weeks of searching. And I'm talking about 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., making phone calls nonstop, looking day after day after day for a house that we would use to shoot in and to house all of these people that were coming out for whom I'd be responsible. And I wound up finding a house after many weeks of searching that we could, all live in, where I could basically keep everyone hostage and shoot whenever I wanted to, and where I could, feed people, house them, etc. And I found the house in Atherton, California. The woman who owned it was named Fran Jabs, and this was a 9-bedroom, 9-bathroom mansion with an elevator in the house, with a tree literally coming out of the kitchen island. There was an Olympic-sized swimming pool in the back, 6.5 acres of land. It was nuts. And the fact that I got it, and I got it for $3,000. So the woman showed me the place. She seemed very nice. And I wrote her a check. And then I never saw her until the end of the shoot, which I'll explain later. But she never even gave me the key. The whole time we were there, we did not have a key for the front door. So imagine that. Imagine all these people and myself and all our equipment, everything. I mean, we had expensive rented 35 millimeter cameras, all our gaffing grip stuff. It was all there and anything could have happened. We also had a warehouse just a short drive away where we'd always be striking and building new sets. So it is worth noting at this point that as a filmmaker, by this point in my maturation process, and let's see, how old am I? I'm 21, going on 22 years old. I had no idea how to write as a producer. In other words, I had no idea how to rein in my vision and my ambition to fit a modest budget. So it was a $100,000 film, or that's all really we had access to. That was not the full budget. And it was conversely a wildly ambitious film with tons of actors, tons of locations. And there was also one more catch in addition to not having a key for the house. Fran Jabs, the lady who I'd rented the house from, left some of her family behind on the property. There was a trailer park-like encampment that was located just a little bit a ways on the property that was near the main house. And, we'd always see them here and there. They'd come on the set and we couldn't kick them out. They lived there. But they were like, white trash-like. The kids would always be covered in dirt. They looked like a sort of methy couple. And so I didn't want to F with them. I knew they had guns. So it was always kind of a tenuous situation when they would show up. The shoot was not going great. And one night our second AD heard one of the sort of dirt-encrusted kids murmuring, "Daddy, no, please don't hit me again," or something to that effect. It was late one night. She wound up calling social services. And, by that point, we were out of money and we were just taking cash advances on the credit cards, paying off cards with other cards. It was really dire. I mean, we had nothing left. We were running on fumes. People were exhausted. They were not normally lengthed days. I mean, these were shooting days that went on and on and on. And frankly, I had no idea at that point quite yet how to direct actors. I knew what I wanted visually. I knew about writing, although I wasn't nearly as good a writer as I am now. But I didn't know how to direct my way out of a paper bag, to be frank. I can see that when I see the footage now. But at the time, I just, it was very stylized. It sort of had a Fellini meets Buckaroo Banzai sort of a thing to it. So basically, after social services was called, we were tossed out on our asses. I remember the night when Fran Jabs finally came back to the house because she'd been told that social services had been called. So she came around all liquored up and wound up, looking around at the messes we'd made and yelling at us and kicked us out on our asses. I, at the time, was living in that two-bedroom apartment I'd told you about back at 5636 California Street in the Richmond district. And I believe there were 16 people total in a two-bedroom apartment. I basically just covered the floor of the apartment in egg crates. And I remember, I just have these vague memories of everyone laying around drinking 40 ounces, just biding time until it was their time to go back to Boston or wherever else. And so, one by one, people would split, and there was just an air of abject failure that kind of hung in the air. And I remember music-wise, I'm pretty sure that the night that we wrapped, the Palace Brothers record, Days of Our Wake, came out. I think I remember that I heard that album that day. When everyone came back to my apartment, I moved into my closet for some privacy and just a solitary space in which I could lick my wounds. I actually loved it in there in a weird way. It was not a happy time in my life. I remember all the stress that I was feeling at the time. It all kind of coagulated in my right ear. I got this massive case of cauliflower ear. My ear blew up. The pictures from that time, which exist, and there aren't many, I just looked confused, in a daze, out of it. My ear, 5 times the size it normally was. Shutting down production, it was just about, if not the most painful thing that I've ever done in my life. And, at that point, there was about $800 somehow scraped up remaining on our credit limit somehow. I don't remember how. And I remember that I slowly but surely spent that as well on this local pizza place that made this amazing tandoori chicken pizza. That yogurt sauce was almost delicious enough to dull the pain, but not quite. Right after that, I filed bankruptcy paperwork. And at the very last minute, my dad, thank God, he convinced me to get the paperwork back, to rescind the entire process. Thankfully, he entered the fray. And, I'm in total gratitude to my dad to this day for doing that. Because what he wound up doing was negotiated the credit card companies down from $40,000 to $13,000. And then he paid it. And I paid my dad $150 a month for years and eventually paid him back. As far as the fate of Jesus 2, for a while I tried to raise finishing funds. I remember going to AFM in 1995. I had a trailer edited together. I remember the tagline was, "He's back and he's not quite himself." And, it was an okay trailer. But, finally I gave up on the project and figured that with the money that I'd need to finish it, and how difficult it would be to get everyone back together, if I could just give up on that and then do things super, super on the cheap and switch to more accessible film genres, that I might have a better shot at things. So that's what I did. I took a class at the Film Arts Foundation with Danny Plotnick on how to shoot on Super 8mm, and I learned how to do it by myself. So I started writing, producing, directing, lighting, shooting, and doing sound for all my films. I was basically a one-man band, and started doing comedy and horror. I started building up, a bunch of really cool shorts, some of which I would just give to video stores in the San Francisco location, like La Video and a bunch of other places. I still think if La Video is there, last time I was there was a Dave Gebroe section that had my early shorts there. And the deal was they could have the videotape for free. As long as it was a loss leader, they would keep it at the counter and offer it as a free rental. It just needed to be on the counter. So they did that. And I actually shot a movie called 38 Geary like that, shot it guerrilla style on the 38 Geary bus, and then dressed up like a bus driver and had somebody videotape me with a cigarette girl box around my neck that said, "Finally a film better than Star Wars, George Lucas." And then I got on a bunch of local talk shows dressed up as a bus driver. I was doing a lot of cool shit at that time with film. And then, after that, I finally made a name for myself with the release of 2 feature films. I'm not happy with how few films that I've made, but I have made 2 films, and both were completed and distributed, and I did receive money for both of them. But with Jesus 2, I felt what it was like to truly fail. I mean, I know what it's like to truly, truly fail, to fall flat on my face, to do a belly flop. That feeling is the worst feeling in the entire world, outside of feeling like you're not loved and that nothing is ever going to be okay. It's just the worst feeling. Basically, it was the most sobering experience of my entire life because I was a dreamer up until that point. And the night that we shut down production, and then I gave up on that film, I did continue to dream, and I really did continue to enact my dreams in my life. But I was not like a Peter Pan guy anymore. That side of me went away that day. And, the night that we shut down, we were still in the house in Atherton. And all of us, everyone who lived there, the crew and some of the cast, at one point that night, we were all drunk and high. And we congregated in a back room off the kitchen. It was a pitch dark room, totally black. I couldn't see anything. And this impromptu chant broke out. It wasn't planned. It wasn't talked about. And it just happened. And you could hear me leading the chant. And I listen to it from time to time because it obviously has a palpable emotional effect for me still to this day. And I think of this chant as a storm rising up and fighting against the dying of the light. And, maybe I didn't consciously realize it at the time. I think maybe I did, but the storm still hasn't abated within me. I'm still chanting that same chant. And here it is. Here's the chant. I want to thank you guys so much for your support. And as you're going to hear, this Friday's episode is pretty intense. This is kind of a lead into that, because in a way, this week is sort of me looking into a mirror, for better or worse on your end. Here's that chant. Take care, guys.
Yeah, yeah,